Okay, we're setting up the meeting. I don't know what that means.
It says on mine that we're live on Facebook.
Really? Can you see you?
No, there's just a note at the top of my screen that says
Meeting is now streaming live. Okay, now I think we are actually live. Okay. So this is so good. We figured it out. Okay. Not that I can necessarily see comments, but let me just say, Gordon, you are an expert in grief and loss, and that is why I wanted to bring you on. So I have questions for you about just during this time and the pandemic and how to work through that. First of all, this is not like dealing with somebody that's died. It's not that kind of grief. So when a lot of people hear grief, they're like, I'm not feeling grief. It's, I'm fine. Can you explain ambiguous loss?
Yeah, it's loss without closure or kind of clear understanding. And so I'll give an example, like with COVID. When my daughter was a senior, like just college day where they all wore their t-shirts was a moment where you began to accept more as a parent that they were leaving, okay? There were other things that you did. I can remember the last day she came in to the kitchen. I made lunches all her years in school, and I was cutting an apple. Every day she wanted an apple cut. And she walked in, and I started weeping, realizing this was the last time I was going to cut her apple. Well, parents aren't having that process with their seniors. They're going to leave, and they know it without knowing it, but there's not markers that make it clearer or that help them to kind of put some closure to the loss. So ambiguous loss is when you don't have a clear understanding that you're encountering a loss or have lost something, and there's not closure. So then that just complicates your grief.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think I'm feeling that with it. I have a senior. So it's such an interesting process of seeing kind of her relief that it's over in some ways, and then the sadness of, so that it does feel complicated because it's so many mixed emotions.
Yeah. And really there would have been mixed emotions at all, but you're not having kind of rituals or tangible things that help you do that. Like, my youngest daughter had 4 good friends that she spent most of her years in school going through. So they would start naming some of the last things they were going to do together. It just puts a marker and helps you, like, we're so grateful for those friends. That's the mixed emotion in those parents. And yet there's loss. Yeah. And so you're kind of working out that confusion as you go through those rituals.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, how do you see the pandemic creating this sort of grief or loss for us now?
Well, I think we just named the kind of like with having a senior, that type of thing. I think some of the other there's huge financial loss for people, and yet they don't know what that's going to look like. Think about someone whose business is closed, who probably hasn't gotten their loan yet or doesn't know, how long is this going to be? Are people going to come back? And so again, they're just in this gray area of really not knowing how much is going to be lost, yet they've begun to experience some loss.
And so what do you recommend how people feel that? Because I think as counselors, we want our clients to feel it, but it's not something you can grab a hold of. And I think a really go-to emotion is just being mad. Yeah.
One of the key areas I studied in my doctorate was called post-traumatic growth. And it's how someone grows through a life-altering event like COVID-19. And one of the things they found was simply processing or naming loss is what helps you feel it. Like having had some people close to me die, and if I then see someone who knew that person, it brings my grief to the surface. So I think other human beings really help with that process. So finding people that let's say your business is closed, maybe grabbing a takeout lunch with one of your employees, and you both talking about what you miss about not being open and your fears, that's going to bring more of that grief to the surface so you actually feel it.
So really naming it, like acknowledging what it is that you miss and that you have lost gives you the ability to start to grieve it.
Yeah. And I would say there's probably two large ways we process things: internal processors and external processors. An external processor probably is aware of it and wants to talk about it, so they need someone to kind of listen. If you're an internal processor, you need someone who's going to ask you some questions and help you kind of name it.
Oh, so it's good. That's how counselors can help if you don't have those external processors to help ask you some questions. And grief, go ahead. What were you
No,
going to say?
and I was going to say, because not everyone grieves by talking. So let's say you have a senior who you're not going to be able to feel graduation. Just pull out some of the yearbooks, pictures of friends, through their years, and just begin to remember all that has kind of brought them to this place. Because that's a lot of what, you might be running into a friend at a school event that you haven't seen, and you know that you're probably not going to see each other because your seniors are graduating, and you talk a little bit about how they were on the soccer team in fifth grade or something. And again, you're just naming what's been lost.
Right. I think that's a great idea to pull out the yearbook and kind of go through that. I think when we hear grief, it's easy to think you should be crying and moping and mourning. Like with this kind of loss, there's a sadness, but it looks different, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And I think that's where, in some ways, the predominance of counseling in our culture has hurt grief a little bit. And what I mean by that, people only think it is talking, people only think it is crying, when grieving can simply be, like, I don't know, if you have a loss and you're not dressed as sharp as you normally do, like outwardly, you're just saying there's been loss in my life. And we don't have a lot of symbolism in our culture that helps us to grieve. So maybe trying to symbolize your loss a little bit. Trying to think of like how someone might do that whose restaurant is closed. Nothing's coming to me right now, but you have to try to create some symbols and rituals that kind of help you do it. But it certainly isn't just crying at all, because a lot of people won't do that. But feeling the sadness and letting it get closer inside you is certainly grieving.
Yeah, just giving yourself the permission to say, gosh, I'm really sad about that. I miss that. It's funny, when I was working on the promotion, the little thing last night, I was working on what to say, and I said it out loud to my husband about, okay, COVID-19, talking to counselors about the grief and the loss of that. And he's like, well, that's not going to make me want to come. I don't want to hear that. And I think that is so part of the culture, is it does feel like it's this huge sadness and huge weight. And what we're just saying is loss can just be acknowledging it and feeling a little bit of the sadness. It doesn't have to be this huge moment.
Yeah. Well, and I would say this, because I know we're trying to add a little bit of faith in this process, because it's normally I'm working with people from faith. And in the scriptures, it talks about how sorrow is better than laughter, because sorrow has a refining influence on us. Or that if we sorrow, kind of godly sorrow, like loss, that we'll never regret that, because it helps us to turn away from like living inside ourselves toward the Lord, towards something better. Because it says, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Like the vulnerability in grief really is an invitation to say, Lord, we really do need you to be bigger in our lives, to hold us, to comfort us, to strengthen us. And so I think grieving can open that door, even though there's vulnerability in it, by naming it, by feeling it. The hope as a believer is that's what invites the Lord near you to help you carry the grief, so to speak.
Oh, that's good. That's good, Gordon. Okay. What about grieving? Well, we kind of talked about this, the loss of what was normal. I think in my idea of the question here is I'm not sure we're going back to what felt normal. I mean, I think that there's a lot of talk about, we may not be handshaking. Europeans may not be doing the greeting of the kiss of cheek to cheek. And I often see, like, my girls are like, when's it going to get back to normal? And having that conversation with them about, well, we don't know what normal looks like. So just, that point, how do you grieve that?
Yeah. This may sound weird, but I think part of the way you grieve that is stepping into some of the good that has come in the loss.
Mm.
Okay. We're playing more games at home, like we're doing things, FaceTiming a little bit more. I mean, I find families are going one or two ways with this. If they're not eaten up too much with the fear and the anxiety, I'm seeing a lot of families that are actually enjoying the downtime and the extra connection. And there's been stuff of this, mention of
Mhm.
this on Facebook, what kind of like, let's take forward what maybe we're learning. So if you cave in on yourself in the grief and kind of shut down and don't enter into some of the good and then take that forward, then the loss owns you. It
Mm.
diminishes you. If you lean into some of the good and then carry that forward and maybe enlarge it, then the loss isn't going to own you. That's where you're not staying stuck, but you're moving forward. And then there's kind of some good connection to what's
Mhm.
happened through
Yeah.
COVID-19.
Yeah, it's like you're starting to find some meaning, and which is really some resilience too. Like when tragedy happens, if you can find some of the place where there's good.
Right, right.
Okay, how can we help our kids grieve this time and the loss of their normal things? I like I said, I keep getting the question, when's it going to be over? When's it going
Yeah.
to be over? And I think for my kids, it's like, when can we resume seeing our
Mhm,
friends in normal life, and how
mhm.
do we help them?
Yeah. I don't want to minimize the whatever difficulty or pain people are experiencing right now by saying this, but the, as a believer, I assume that we're in a world we weren't made for. We were
Mm,
not made for death. We were not made for loss. Okay. And so we actually have to learn how to feel it and process it, knowing that part of the solution is heaven, the coming kingdom, a world different than this. So I
mm,
was talking to family this week, and they were talking about their child who was asking, "When am I going to see my friends again? When can we touch people again?" And they gave him a solution and a quick answer. And I said, "Why did?" I said, "You could have said something simply like, 'Gosh, that must be hard.
mm,
What are you feeling?'" And then to simply move towards him and say, "Gosh, that's really hard," without putting a closure to it, then the parent is helping the child carry some of their grief.
mhm,
They're also teaching the child that sometimes grief is ongoing. Like too
mm,
often in our world, we're trying to navigate away from that and create a life where there isn't grief. But even like the grief of a child going off to college, like when our first went to school and we dropped her off at college, I wept all the way home. And
mhm,
then the next day drove all around Homewood, remembering all the things that we had done, grieving. And like I can remember thinking, we didn't go to the Grand Canyon. We didn't, like all the things I dreamed for this girl. And she's a really good kid, young
mm,
woman now. And yet grieving that helped me to remember who she really is, and then gave me energy. If God is comforting us through that grief by being vulnerable with him, he's giving us buoyancy now to latch on to her new stage in life. And
mm.
so that's why you have to kind of be able to feel the grief, but also latch on to the good that's there. But there's going to be both of those emotions, like
Mm.
sorrow and hope at the same time.
Okay, you said some really important things. First of all, I love that you were like, we need to let our kids know that grief, there's no time frame with
Right,
grief, that
right.
there is uncertainty, but to give them the permission to not put a time frame and not feel like we have to fix it for them.
Yeah. And COVID-19 can be a way that we begin practicing at that.
Hmm. And then you talked about, because you were able to grieve your daughter, it was able to help launch you into a place where you could enter new relationship with her. Because if you still see her as the high school student forever,
Right,
that
right,
doesn't launch you to a
right.
place of, no, she's a young adult and she needs something different from me now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And grieving well actually gives you the buoyancy, the ability to do the new. That's why it's
Mm,
important. A lot of times, grieving is letting go burdens we've been carrying that weren't ours to carry. Like part of what I was letting go was I didn't give my daughter a perfect childhood. Well, I was never gonna.
right.
It was good to let that go.
Mm. Oh, that's good. That's good. Okay, Gordon. What surprised you about this health crisis from a spiritual sense?
Um, this may sound, I don't know, different or presumptuous or something, but I think maybe this is more of a sadness, like the way I talked about how believers should already have been processing grief and that we live in a fallen world. And I just think we should be more prepared for moments like this, but I mean in our heart, okay? Where then we enter into it and we actually stand up in the difficulty because we've had some practice at it.
Mm.
And I guess some of the noise in the church, the unpreparedness, the inability to enter into the grief has been a grief for me because I just think we could be practicing at it more.
Right.
Now, again, I'm working with people all across the board, and I've actually seen, again, some people who have some buoyancy in the grief. That's a buffer, because if they didn't have that buoyancy, they would be more anxious and worried about finances and things. But having some practice of the grief, it's almost a buffer where they're not taken in so much by the anxiety, and are now enjoying some of the downtime, connection as a family, some of those other things.
Yeah.
So I guess I've been sad where we haven't been living as a church robustly, and we don't see that more across the board.
Yeah, that's good. What do you hope that will change in us because of this?
Well, I think it's something really that has been kind of, I was going to say, taught in the scriptures. Oh, like the scriptures are pretty old, so they've always been there. But it's a verse it occurs in James and Romans, where it talks about trials and tribulation, and it simply talks about endurance, and then a strength of character that leads to hope or being ready for anything. And kind of the theme is, if the problems and trials in your life help you endure better, which means you're able to welcome the difficulties and at least have a curiosity about how they might work on you. Like, I think when it says in the scriptures, be joyful for difficulty, it's not saying like be happy and excited about difficulty. Right. It's more, there's something it can bring as we lean into it, right? And as we lean into it and let the difficulty work on us, what a difficulty like COVID-19 does is it exposes the things that you've trusted that aren't as trustworthy, okay? My drive to work helps me to process a little bit, helps me be prepared. My workspace helps me to focus in. Not having some of that, I'm unsettled. So I needed some new faith to work at home, right? So just leaning into the difficulty and being like, Lord, help me develop new rhythms and, trust in those, and then I'll be more present in my counseling. But losing things that you trusted in creates an opportunity for new faith, for new maturity, right? And I think the more we're able to do that, then we're growing in faith. So I kind of hope and pray that maybe that's what we learn a little bit, that this COVID-19 in a large scale has shown us how letting others in, there's been a lot where we've worked harder to connect because we realize we need it. Now we can go forward and maybe practice at that type of thing better, long range.
I love the picture. Just as you're talking, I'm thinking about buoyancy and buoyancy in situations like this. If our faith isn't strong, then we're so thrown when something happens, that the more mature we grow in our own faith, the more we see something coming and we're not so immediately, freaked out. Of course, we can get freaked out, but we have a trust and a hope that there's a good God underneath us securing us. Yeah.
I don't think we often think of the faith process a little bit like a physical process. Like in 1995, my wife and I miscarried, or my wife miscarried, but it was the first time I really felt sadness in my life about a present event. So that ushered me into practicing at sorrow and grieving. Almost 2 decades later, my brother took his life, which was a much bigger loss and a much harder loss. Yet I had actually built muscles where I was able to grieve better. And I just felt myself moving through my brother's loss with an ability to grieve that provided refreshment as I grieved, instead of getting stuck in it, and like those muscles had built over time. So that's why I even said, I think COVID-19 is a good opportunity to practice wherever we are in that process of grieving, and to think that's what we want to do, is in a daily way, continue to practice in hopes that builds faith, hope, and love, spiritual muscles in us that will give us more buoyancy in future difficulty.
Right. Right. I think too, just I'm wondering how that helps us to become curious, with ourselves, but with the people around us. When we're not so flattened with fear and anxiety, we can't ask ourselves what's flattening us, and we don't get curious. And then when we don't get curious, we're kind of stuck in ourselves, that we don't reach out to our own family to go, you seem really anxious. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's something you model well, curiosity. And it's such a great word, Sarah. And I think if sin turns us in on ourselves, then our faith should turn us outward towards curiosity, where we're giving and receiving more in relationship. That's just a great word to be thinking about. We want to grow that kind of curiosity.
Yeah. I think that that's so powerful as parents too, to not feel so responsible to fix and to comfort and to take away the pain, but to help them walk through their pain. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think we forget that sharing burdens makes them lighter.
mm-hmm.
Like, we don't want to have our own burdens, and we don't want to help others carry their burdens. So now each person's burden's heavier. But if we had more humility and openness to simply share our burdens, I think they would be lighter.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Any other closing thoughts you've got? Gordon, technologically, we killed it. It only took us 25 minutes.
Yeah,
But...
there was only a little bit of perseverance in that.
Right.
Yeah.
Some closing thoughts, Gordon?
Not really. I mean, I think we covered some good things. I just would, again, try to see COVID-19 as an invitation towards more, in a way that we don't minimize what was lost, that we do both at the same time, that we feel the loss wherever it is, because some people are losing people. I mean, huge loss, or businesses. Like, there's no way to minimize that.
Right.
So I really want us to feel that, and even the mystery and anger and frustration, whatever words we want to use. But at the same time, we stay curious about the possibilities of what could emerge if we let our hearts go there.
Good. I love it. Thanks so much. I am going to get you back on one day. Thanks, Gordon.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It was good to be with you.
Yep. I don't know. Does it say, am I done?